We started to read about Pythagoras last time, and let's see. So let's look on page 204, and you see there's two diagrams there. So those are kind of thing that Pythagoreans are up to.
The definition sheet,
So let's look at the definition sheet, for a minute, and then we'll look at page 204. I guess Mario, definition sheet, page 6, Pythagoras in the middle. I'll give you a minute.
Yes, Pythagoras held that the numbers are the basic principles of the universe and basis of all knowledge,
So mathematicism,
mathematics,
meaning that all of knowledge just boils down to math. Now, he didn't actually, well, really it's more of a mathematicism regarding the universe, because they didn't, they said it was the base of all knowledge, but they still had a lot to say about other things. So it's not just the kind of reductionism, strictly speaking. James, two groups.
Two groups of Pythagoreans. One, the hearers, are cosmatical, focus on religious and ethical aspects of Pythagoreanism. A uses methodological language, unproved and unargued. Two, the learned, mathematical, focus on philosophical and mathematical aspects. Irrational, compare, similar distinction in Taoism.
Taoism, yeah.
Taoism.
Okay, so those are the Greek terms, and those are the two aspects of it. So let's look at on page 204, right? He shows you this thing, the tetractys, right? Tetra means four, right? The triangle with the 4-unit base was called a tetractys and was held in high reverence, right? You see the 4, 3, 2, 1, the proportion there, mathematical proportion. He gives you a little diagram there of what they call masculine and feminine progression, either with odd or even numbers. So a lot of analysis of numbers, also tying that in with music. Page 205, right, fractions. So they had all of that kind of going on. At page 206, the ratio between the length of a hypotenuse and the length of the side. So that's the Pythagorean theorem, right? A squared plus b squared plus c squared, if you remember from geometry. At the bottom it says, right, certain ratios between lines are incommensurate. So the example of square root of 2 for the hypotenuse of a triangle, a right triangle. Okay, let's go on to page 207, because like I said, we don't need to read all this in class, it's detailed. Cosmology and astronomy.
cosmology and astronomy. Pythagorean musical and mathematical conceptions found their highest expression in the cosmological doctrine of the music of the spheres. When Pythagoras declared that there is a universal harmony, a grand musical pattern, in the movements of the universe, he was expressing in his own style of concrete imagining a conviction that rational law governs the universe. For to the Pythagorean mind, it must be remembered, music was identical with number, and number in turn was conceived geometrically. Consequently, what the music of the spheres primarily affirmed was the presence of a geometrical order among the motions of the sun, moon, planets, and fixed stars. Since the circle in its perfection and simplicity made the strongest appeal to the unsophisticated mathematical sensibilities of the Greeks, the meaning of astronomical law became naturally affixed to it.
Okay, so that's their astronomy tying in. So they're trying to tie together all these different things. They're mathematics, astronomy, music, and this is very influential. So we talked about the trivium, right? There's also the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And that basically goes back to the Pythagoreans, as you can see, right? That goes back even before right, Aristotle or Plato. Okay, no, page 208, he goes into more about their astronomy, right, the planets, and positing a counter-Earth that on the other side of this, they actually thought there was a central fire, so it's kind of complicated astronomy that they're coming up with. So that's very influential in not just the ancient period, right, but even the medieval period, because the medieval period, that's what the quadrivium goes back to, right? And it was a Pythagorean who first, brought up the quadrivium. Oh, I'm sorry, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay. Okay, so that's, we're not going to really talk too much about that. He does a good job presenting it, so you can see how in the summary. Brother James, the soul, on the other hand, it's really not that much interest for us, the details of astronomy and so on, but the soul, on the other hand, that's much kind of more important for what we're doing here, right? And that he's the first one to talk about the soul as being immortal. This is against the materialist Milesians who we had read about. So, right, for Thales, the soul is, if a magnet has a soul, it's quite materialistic. Now here, Thales, the Milesians never talk about an immortal soul. Just so you realize, right, the myths did not talk, I've mentioned this before, but right, the myths did not talk about the soul as being immortal. They talked about the gods as being immortal. So that's a radical shift to say that the soul is immortal, because that was a kind of epithet for the gods, but not for the soul, right? Because the fact that your soul went into Hades, they never call that immortality, because Hades is kind of like a state of death or a brother.
The soul in its destiny, to a degree and in a manner which it is difficult for a modern thinker to realize. Trained as he is in the race of specialism, the Pythagoreans regarded mathematical and astronomical studies
Astronomical
studies as inseparable from moral and religious disciplines and from personal self-examination. Behind the practices of self-discipline and self-examination, which were part of the daily life, there lay a profound set of convictions about the nature and destiny of the soul.
Right, so see, he's right about that. The feature, and it's a positive thing, we have all these different branches of knowledge and science and so on. But for them, they're blending it together. Although I guess, being Catholic, right, we have some familiarity with this. Our theology and our prayer, go together.
First, the soul is immortal. It existed before what we call birth and will go on existing after what we call death. The present life is a sojourn, a temporary stage in a long pilgrimage, and the body, soma, was likened to a tomb, sema, in which they held the soul has to live out a sort of shadow life, a half-life, which is more nearly death than it is life.
Okay, so this is part of our reading this is because these are ideas that are going to be in Plato. So Plato's going to incorporate a lot of this, and right, as I said, Plato and Aristotle are the two main branches or foundations of Western philosophy. So Plato will actually quote this approvingly. He'll say, as some people say, the body is actually a tomb. He doesn't say, as the Pythagoreans say, but that's who he's relying on. Okay.
Starting from these premises, a man's primary purpose will be not a pursuit of the so-called goods which the present life offers, but a preparation through self-discipline and self-harmonization for the larger life into which he may be destined to enter hereafter.
Okay. So there's and then reincarnation is going to be another theme here. So what's good is that he said the soul was immortal. What's not so good is that he said that there is a cycle of reincarnation. So this is right how things often are in philosophy. The development, there's maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Jake, the bottom from the belief. 209.
From the belief that we have lived before,
and in better circumstances than now. An educational corollary follows. Learning in the present life is really recollection. The fundamental truths are already known to us in the depths of our unconscious selves, and the purpose of education should therefore be to stir these hidden parts of us into activity, rather than to impose truths upon them from outside sources.
Okay, so that's another theme that's in Plato. Let's go to page 216. So here we have Aristotle, right, who knew Plato, who studied under Plato for 17 years, if I'm not mistaken. And he's going to explicitly say that Plato took some of his ideas from the Pythagoreans. Robert, number T14 of 216.
In Plato's theory of participation, the only original contribution is the change of name. For where the Pythagoreans say that things exist by imitation, the mimesis of numbers, Plato prefers to say they exist by participation.
Reflexus.
In
Right. So, I mean, that's a good authority, right? That for the dependence of Plato, or the influence of Pythagoreans on Plato. Okay. So that's an important, right, theme is the soul. Let's read on page 212 for a minute. So this is from this is from the Phaedo by Plato. And
Which part of 212?
Page 212, T4.
See this. But tell me, Socrates, why is suicide held to be unlawful? Philolaus, about whom you were just asking, has affirmed this doctrine in my hearing, and so have other Pythagoreans. But I have not quite understood the reason for it. Socrates, you are troubled, I suppose, by the paradox that although a good man is better off after dying, he is not permitted to seize that benefit by an act of his own, but must await the hand of another.
So this is very different from, once again, sometimes people paint with a very broad brush. They make sweeping statements about ancient Greek philosophy. The Stoics, some of the Stoics thought, in a sense, they thought with suicide was okay. Some of them did treat suicide as okay, not just for any reason, but they didn't have an absolute prohibition against suicide, the Stoics, just to keep it simple. And so here, in that sense, the Stoics are kind of decadent compared to what came before. Because for Plato and for the Pythagoreans, as you can see here, Philolaus in particular, another Pythagorean, taught that suicide is always wrong. So they're addressing these moral issues. And then Socrates explains why. Now, it's interesting, too, because even though Cebes is visiting from Italy, if I'm not mistaken, and he knows the Pythagoreans, and he's visiting Socrates in Athens. And so he said, well, like, I know that the Pythagoreans say you're not supposed to kill yourself, but what is the reason for that? And then Socrates' reason says, right, well, it's true you're better off after dying. Why? Your soul is immortal. And for Pythagoras, it doesn't go down to Hades, which is this kind of state of death, right, of unhappiness and so on. It goes to, eventually, after the cycle of reincarnation, it would go to a happy place. So that's what he means, right? That you're better off after dying, because if you've been a good person, you'll die and go to a happy place. Okay.
Let me tell you of a doctrine which the Pythagoreans teach in religious secrecy, to the effect that man has been stationed here in a kind of prison from which he has no right to release himself and run away.
So that's this soma sema idea that the body is the tomb is the word sema, but another image that's used, the body is a tomb or the body is a prison for the soul. Some of the later testimonies, this is right where you have to kind of piece things together. It says that it's some fault of ours that we've been put in this cycle of reincarnation. Our souls have been put in it. When he says they teach it in religious secrecy, that's probably Plato speaking, because Plato was friendly with Pythagoreans, and so since he's a fellow philosopher, they could have told him things that they teach. Okay.
There is something profound in the doctrine which goes beyond my understanding, but at any rate, I believe with them that the gods are our guardians, and that we mortals are justly in their possession.
Right. So we don't have the right to abandon our body, because he could say, well, if I'm going to be even though I'm going to be reincarnated, I'm allowed to kill myself and move on to the next body, and that was their right. That basically we don't have the right to do that. It's God of the gods who would make that decision, not us. Okay, let's see. We're just hitting some of the highlights here. So like T6 about their fear of number, right? Even and the odd, and all this stuff. Let's see. Let's, I guess, on a lighter note, we could read about their mode of life, T24. Matthew, T24, 218. This is less analytic and philosophical, more just historical.
Those who committed themselves to the guidance of his doctrines acted as follows. They performed their morning walks alone and in places where there was appropriate solitude and quiet, for they considered it contrary to wisdom to enter into conversation with another person until they had rendered their own souls calm and their minds harmonious. It is turbulent behavior, they believed, to mingle with a crowd immediately on arising from sleep. But after their solitary morning walk, they would associate with one another to discuss the teachings and to exchange suggestions for improving the style of behavior. Then they would walk together, visiting temples and other worthy places.
Okay, so, see, like I was saying about kind of a monastic life.
I can't agree with them. Keep going.
You kind of agree, yeah.
Their next step was to care for the health of the body. Some would anoint themselves for their race course. Others would compete at wrestling in the gardens and groves, or at high jump with leaden weights in their hands, while others would practice the art of pantomime.
Or pantomime.
Sorry?
It's just
Okay.
pronounced pantomime, yeah.
Pantomime, okay.
like a mime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Contrasting types of exercise were sought with a view to improving the strength and health of the body.
Okay, and he goes on with giving you more details about that. Zeke, page 220, by such discipline.
By such discipline, the Pythagoreans sought to arrange their lives entirely for the purpose of following God. They held that all things are possible with the gods, and that one ought to seek benefits only from the divine Lord of all.
So this is where that same inclusive monotheism we saw in Xenophanes, who's before them, right? He's a bit earlier than Pythagoras. But also it's inclusive because it also includes talking about the lower gods and spirits and souls. Okay?
But since it is not easy for man to know what are things in which God takes joy, they studied the art of divination, which is the art of interpreting the benevolence of God as manifested in the world.
Remember we read Socrates, he was saying, oh, well, that's, divination, so similarity there, right? He maybe was influenced by that. Christian?
Music, medicine, and divination were the sciences most highly esteemed by the Pythagoreans. They practiced the habit of silence and were alert to listen. In medicine, they studied the values of symmetry, of labor, food, and repose. On the right preparation of food and the proper manner of eating it, they placed much importance. They avoided incisions and burnings when they could. Some illnesses they cured by incantations. They considered health to be greatly benefited by music when rightly employed.
Okay, so all this, see how this is something that, right, there's a guy named Pierre Hadot who works in this Hadot, it was philosophy as a way of life, right, in the ancient world. And then that was basically superseded by Christianity, right? Christianity became the way of life. And you can see Christianity includes a lot of these things, right? Like moderation with food and, right, we have like Lent, all these different practices.
Yeah.
So You guys get up and have mass first thing in the morning before you maybe talk to each other. Okay. Timothy, page 221, T27, just that first sentence.
Pythagoras wrote nothing, as was also the case with Socrates. None of the
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, well, actually, I guess you can keep reading. This is why it's kind of, the lack of writings is not a positive thing from the perspective of, the history of philosophy.
none of Pythagoreans have noted down anything in all the generations up to the time of
Philolaus.
Philolaus. He was the first, and he published those three well-known books with Dion of Syracuse. It's said to have brought at Plato's request for 100, meaning.
Right, so that's why he actually has a section on Philolaus, because he was the first one to write it down. And previous to that, it was just an oral tradition, right? So we talk about in Scripture, the oral tradition, like in the New Testament. That's a partial record of what they believe, right? There's a lot of things they don't like. They don't really go into infant baptism in the New Testament, right? Now it's present there, but they don't actually say that explicitly. It's because there's also an oral tradition that is broader than what was written down. And for the early Pythagoreans, that's all they had up until Philolaus, who's about 100 years after Pythagoras. Page 223, he divided.
He divided his disciples into two groups, which he distinguished as esoteric and exoteric. To those of the former group, he entrusted the study of the more developed forms of science. To the latter, the more moderate.
So that, you guys are familiar with the word esoteric? That means for a small group. Exoteric means for the broader public. So that matches up with the hearers, right, would be the exoteric group that's keeping it simpler. It's the religious ethical aspects, which are simple, right, comparatively. The esoteric group would be the ones delving into like math and more complicated things.
He experimented with what is called magic, and it was he who first established the science of physiology.
So magic, this is basically the distinction between magic and experimental science was not really clear for most of human history. Now, there's things that were clearly, there were things that were clearly magic and things that were clearly scientific, but there was a very large gray area between the two. So like, what is the influence of the moon, right? I don't know, if you cut the mistletoe when there's a full moon, is it because of science that you think it'll help heal someone better? Or is it because of magic? Well, it's a huge gray area. Because they didn't know. They just think, well, there's the moon that it affects the tides, and then maybe somehow it affects the mistletoe, so if I cut it, it'll work better. You see what I mean? That's why alchemy, right? Alchemy was both kind of like experimental science, it was like pre-chemistry, and it was magic. So now, of course, with Catholicism, they were aware of those distinctions to a considerable degree, but not 100%, right? And so really that blending or that non-distinction, that big gray area goes all the way back to the ancient world, right? Like, how do you tell the difference? Sometimes it's clear, but sometimes it's not. So when they said magic, it did mention incantations, right? So they're probably saying, we'll pray to the spirits, the daimons, right? It's not necessarily something bad, because, right, it's kind of a bit, it could be anachronistic, right? For one thing, right, they're adopting the Greek religion. At least they're adopting the practices of it, even with a different meaning. It was he first established the science of that's a bad translation there. It should be his first established physiogony, meaning the study of nature. So cosmogony is the origin of the cosmos. Physiogony is the origin of nature. Right? I know cosmology is the study of the cosmos. Cosmogony is the origin of the cosmos. Theogony, the birth of the gods. Cosmogony, the birth of the cosmos. Physiogony, the birth of nature. Okay, so that's the translation isn't quite right there.
Yeah, I just had a quick question.
Yes.
This seems so similar to Gnosticism. Like, did Gnosticism get any influences?
Sure,
from this?
100%.
Because they talk about the secret rituals, and they're talking about the divinization and magic. I didn't know if that was something that
Yeah, Gnosticism is much later. But the funny thing, Gnosticism doesn't typically come up in philosophy class. Maybe it should, because it's syncretism, taking things from like philosophers, like Platonism, more than Neoplatonists, taking things from magic in the bad sense, and then taking things from Christianity. So that's syncretism that, yes, is influenced by Neoplatonism. But remember, Neoplatonism is influenced by Pythagoreanism. And then there are actually Pythagoreans who are still around. Like they were still around for centuries, along with Plato and Aristotle. That school of thought. School makes it sound kind of official. It's not really official the way that you understand now. We have nowadays. So yeah, there's definitely the reincarnation idea. Plato adopts that 100%. And so if you have a Gnostic who's teaching reincarnation in the context of Greece, he's following Plato and Pythagoras on that. He figures. And ironically, I mean, the modern day Gnostics and people who are into magic, when it's really not excusable anymore, right? Because there's not this big gray area, because we do know about science now that, like, if you're cutting down the mistletoe when the moon is up, like, that doesn't have to do with, like, that's superstition and so. So even then, they'll still refer back to Pythagoras and say, oh, this is like the ancient wisdom of Pythagoras and so on.
So that happened after the French. Did that happen after the French Revolution? I remember reading in some of my classes some of the cults that popped up in France. They were talking about like music of the four seasons and the harmonies.
I was at the Jefferson Paris book sale. It happens twice a year, and they had a book called The Secrets of Pythagoreanism. I was like, okay, well, let's see what he has to say about Pythagoras. The author's guy is Fabre d'Olivet, and he talks about Pythagoras, and he was also kind of in occultism. So occultism is like magic and spells, and he was into Freemasonry. He wrote a book about the secrets of Freemasonry. So yeah, that stuff does tend to overlap. Yeah, and he was French, and then he was prided himself in having cured a child, but then he said that he did it with magic. So after the French Revolution, when the Catholic Church was in charge, you basically could not publicly do those things. That's actually something the Inquisition was in charge of. So magic was against the law; it was illegal. So they did have a distinction about that. Even though there was a gray area, like with alchemy, with certain things, they could tell, well, if you're praying to I don't know, who's the goddess of magic in the Greek pantheon, whatever her name is. Hecate, exactly. If you're praying to Hecate, that's not chemistry. And if you're praying to Hecate, that's not astronomy. Right, so sometimes it was crystal clear, and that's why that it was made illegal. But it really, I think, was a kind of, it actually survived all those years from the conversion of Constantine up until the French Revolution. For over 1,000 years, I think out in the remote areas there weren't full-on shamans, but and it's funny, the National Group, they would have things like these strange kind of pre-Christian customs that still exist in like rural Europe of like making a straw man and then burning it ritually and for them it's just a festival, but the people who are into occultism know that that's actually a remnant of, because they'll do things like burning effigies, poking, about voodoo, poking things in effigies. So it's funny how, right, there's still a remnant of that in Europe after all those centuries. And but it came back in a big way in the 1800s. That's a big part of 1800s culture is spiritism. So there, and the guy mentioned who was like publicly admitting that he cured someone with a spell, like, and this is like I said, Hecate or something like that, or what's his name? Aleister Crowley said Thoth was speaking through him, the Egyptians. So they'll incorporate ancient pagan gods of so on like that. So it's obvious that that's not philosophy. But the ironic thing is, when I went to Half Price Books in Houston, I was like, oh, they have a metaphysics section. This is great. I went to the metaphysics section. I was expecting to see like Aristotle's metaphysics, Thomas's commentary, maybe Albert's commentary, Avicenna's metaphysics, maybe some Leibniz in there, Descartes, and the whole metaphysics section was books on occult, magic, spells. So even that, the very use of the term metaphysics, not for philosophy, for magic, it's that same kind of them blending all these things, like, right, the book is called, and he did know about Pythagoras, the guy, his name is Fabre d'Olivet, doesn't really matter, he's not like a major figure. But he does know about, like, he'll talk about Pythagoras and say, see, like, Pythagoras knew there was reincarnation, so we know there's reincarnation. Whereas under Christendom, you weren't allowed to say there was reincarnation because obviously, right? And so, yeah. So that is, the French Revolution was definitely, and just the whole Enlightenment period, basically one extreme engenders the other. This kind of very super strict reason where science is everything led to a counter experience of like, well, what about seances? Like, you say you can explain everything, well, I'm going to go to a seance, and then at the seance, the board is floating off the table. Like, how does science explain that? So instead of going, you see what I mean? It's from one extreme to the other. Instead of saying, well, because scientism is wrong, we should go back to going to mass and receiving the sacraments, and, I don't know, saying the rosary and reading the Bible. It was like, well, I'm a strict scientist. Oh, well, I go to the seance and I see the board floating in the air. Okay, well, I guess, now sometimes it was fake, but other times it's not fake. So that was part of the whole 1800s, and in America too. So yes, when it says magic, all we can do is piece things together. When it says incantations, was it a negative thing? You don't even. But based on everything that I read here, it's more. I think it was more probably praying to Apollo, like it mentions here, right, on page 222. So how do we figure out what does the term magic mean here? Because there were people who. The version of the ancient Greek version of magic was Hecate. She was curses and things like that, right? So that they did have magic back then in the sense of typical like black magic, cursing people, and things like that. But it says on page 222 at the middle, the only altar at which he worshipped was that of Apollo, the life giver, right? So when incantations, if they're praying to Apollo to heal the person, once again, that's would make sense within inclusive monotheism, right? Because Apollo was supposed to be overall a positive figure, whereas Hecate is definitely a negative figure. I've read Gnostic texts, like they'll pray to the Furies to curse people, things like that, right? So there are certain figures that they appeal to. Right, he did not sacrifice animal victims, according to Aristotle. Vegetarianism was part of it. So it seems much more like a kind of philosophical monasticism than like people, right? This is not Hecate and the Furies and the Erinyes or the other ones, Erinyes, cursing your enemies with them. Like they found texts like that in archaeologists, right? And like shards of, so that shows you that's ancient black magic. Okay, page 225 is okay, here we go. That's definitely worth reading a little bit. So, maybe I'll put this on the board. So, right, in his own way, he's very sophisticated. I mean, the Pythagorean theorem, right, that's pretty impressive, right? We still teach the Pythagorean theorem in geometry thousands of years later. So, right, it's a foundation, very foundational for Western civilization, right? Things that have just, we take for granted. But on the other hand, kind of very primitive. So that the soul is immortal is a novelty, right? Versus the immortal gods, the Athanatos is death, Athanatos, immortal, Athanatoi, plural, Theoi, Athanatoi, Theoi, immortal gods. So it was almost kind of blasphemous to call the soul immortal, right? Because that's taking what's true for the gods and putting it on humans, the soul. And so that's where, almost a kind of divinization it would have sounded like to them. And so, remember the persecution where they burned down the building and killed a whole bunch of them? Because they basically were like, we've had enough of this. Plus he's telling us that, we shouldn't eat beans. I know you saw that in the text. The dietary restrictions. But then, so that's positive, and on the other hand, there's reincarnation. Where's the, did you guys, anyone know what the text is where he talks about the dog, someone's beating the dog, and then he says, stop doing that because I can hear like the soul of my. Does anyone see what that is? If you find it, that one is definitely worth reading because that's one of the most. That's the earliest outside reference to Pythagoras is from Heraclitus, and therefore you really can't debate with it like that it's genuine because it's so early before. You also get into the problem of later accretions, things being added on. So reincarnation, when he said don't beat the dog because I can hear the voice of the whoever has been reincarnated into it crying out. Yeah. Let's look at 225, T38. Who's next?
Pythagoras conceived the soul as comprising three parts: reason, intelligence, and passion.
Okay, so this is also very important because the parts of the soul is an important thing. Like, remember, I think I've talked about that before. So like, we're rational animals. We have intellect and will. Those are like parts of our soul. Well, here's the first philosopher to talk about parts of the soul. Notice, did Thales talk about parts of the soul? No. I mean, how is the magnet going to have parts to its soul, right? Soul just seems to be this force that causes motion everywhere. But here he's giving you three parts of the soul taught by Pythagoras. So this is even before Plato, but it kind of makes sense. Plato talks about the parts of the soul in the Republic. It makes sense that he wasn't just the first person to invent that, because it was known, right, that he was influenced by Pythagoras. So that Pythagoras would have been the first one to say, okay, here's the three parts of the soul: reason, intelligence, right, the rational animal idea, and then passion, our emotions. So that's philosophical psychology, right? The different faculties or capacities. Okay.
The two latter are possessed by other animals as well, but reason is in man alone.
Okay, so what is he saying that animals have? Anybody? Intelligence. Right? Why would he say that?
Because they're sensory. No, because they're souls that are reincarnated.
Exactly. Because Aristotle, right, animals, they're not rational. So sensation and intelligence are two different things. But if humans have intelligence and humans are reincarnated into animals, then animals have intelligence. So, right, from an Aristotelian perspective, we really wouldn't want to say animal intelligence, except maybe metaphorically. But in proper sense, they don't have intelligence. But for him, because of reincarnation, they do. And by the way, I mean, Hinduism is similar. And it says Herodotus, who's the first real historian in the Western world, really the first historian as we conceive of history, as opposed to a court chronicler, an imperial chronicler. Right, even in the Old Testament, it's more of a chronicle of the kings of Israel, right? It's not like telling you about the culture and like habits and lifestyle, whereas Herodotus included all that, right? So Herodotus was another super early mention of Pythagoras, right? Because the earlier mentions are more reliable. Iamblichus is in here. Iamblichus is like 200 AD, so that's 700 years later, right? A huge amount of water under the bridge, right, in 700 years when he's writing about Pythagoras. But Herodotus says that Pythagoras got the idea of reincarnation from the East. He said he was the first one to teach reincarnation amongst the Greeks, and he said he got it from the East. The obvious answer to the source would be Hinduism, because Hinduism has already been around for quite some time. Obviously not in the modern contemporary form, but right. And so there was a lot of trade routes between India and Greece, which is, of course, the apostles took advantage of that, right, to spread the gospel. But so he could have traveled. It says he traveled to Egypt. If there were Indians visiting, right, then he could have learned it there. But some other people say he traveled to Persia, which is also in the East. So he would have heard about it and then brought it back. But you see how it's consistent, right? The animals have to have intelligence. Now, how much they use it might be another question. That kind of points that out, that it's kind of limited in them. They can't use it to the same degree, but they do have, you understand, human souls, formerly human souls. I guess, do you want to read, Derek, the bodily seat?
Yeah. The bodily seat of the soul extends from the heart to the brain. The portion that is in the heart is passion, while the portions located in the brain are reason and intelligence.
So notice, not only they're powers of the soul, but they have a place in the body. So it's both soul and body. This is very foundational for Plato, for Aristotle, and really for Thomas Aquinas and the whole medieval period. All the scholastics talk about powers of the soul, from St. Anselm and 1000 up until the last scholastic in 1750, right? Some obscure Thomist or Scotus that no one's ever heard of, right? And whereas the moderns eventually rejected talking about powers of the soul, because Descartes was a dualist, so your body doesn't actually have any powers. It's just your soul, and your body is a machine. So your machine doesn't have any powers, right? only the soul has them. And then if you're a materialist, you get rid of the soul and you just have the machine. And the machine doesn't have powers. So there's a seat of the soul. The heart, passion resides in the heart. That makes sense, right? Your heart beats faster if you have a strong emotion. Reason, intelligence, in the brain. I mean, so he's actually right about that. Whether you think with your brain or your heart was debated from, this is one of the first instances of saying it's with your brain. That wasn't resolved until about the year 1600, so that wasn't resolved for more than 2,000 years after this, 2,100 years later. It was William Harvey who finally gave a definitive answer that the purpose of your heart is to pump blood, it's not to think, because they thought it had all these other, there's 2,000 years of speculation what the heart was doing. It cooled the blood, it heated the blood, the brain cooled it, that was what Aristotle said. Right? So the science took millennia to actually work itself out, and people working on it for millennia. Go ahead.
Sense perceptions are drops distilled from these. Reason is immortal, all else is mortal.
Okay, so going into more detail, it's not even the whole soul that's immortal, it's only reason, which kind of makes sense because, right, you forget things. If my whole soul is immortal, then my memory should be immortal. I should remember my previous lives, right? Now maybe you'll have like a dream. I've known people who are like into like tarot cards and things like that. I think crystal balls, and they think that they were reincarnated. They'll have a dream like, oh, that was my previous life. They'll look into their previous lives. So it does, like you said, that's the Gnosticism. But even before that, it's incorporating Pythagoreanism. So you are right about that. So the soul is actually, the soul is immortal, but it's reason that, to be precise, that's immortal. Not, for example, your memory. Maybe there's some echo of that comes to you in a dream, but it's really your reason that lives on. But also, the other thing that's going to come across here is the soul seems to be kind of understood in a material way. So even though when we think immortal soul, we immediately think immaterial soul. But remember, he's a very early pre-Socratic, right? Sensation is like a drop. But as we read more, I think we'll see this. Go ahead.
The soul draws nourishment from the blood. The rational powers of the soul are of the nature of breath. They and the soul itself are invisible.
So which pre-Socratic does that remind us of? Anybody? Exactly, Anaximenes. Remember he said the soul and breath pervades the world. The soul is air. So it seems like he's agreeing with Anaximenes, who's basically a little bit earlier than him, right? He comes after Anaximander. So he says it's made of breath, right? If we want to take this text seriously, which there really isn't a reason not to, right? So we can put CF compare Anaximenes. He's also agreeing with, Homer, right? Remember, for Homer, you breathe out your soul, psyche, right? Like I said, it's from to blow on something. So you see what I mean? It's you have to be very careful not to be anachronistic and to read back. So for Plato, the soul is immaterial, right? There's no question about that. But you would tend to think, oh, well, then must be immaterial for Pythagoras. Honestly, that's what I used to think. I was like, sure, if he influenced Plato. But then reading this, I thought, wait a minute, it explicitly says your soul is made out of air. So just because your soul is invisible doesn't mean that it's immaterial, right? Can you see air? No. Right? But is it material? Yes. So your soul is breathed out of your body. And what I could put there, you might think, well, he's a philosopher, but yeah, I mean, also Homer, remember, he does still practice the Greek religion. At least he worships Apollo, as it said, to some limited extent. So this would also reflect kind of a Homeric influence, right? That he's, as a Greek, he wants to base his idea on what came before. Okay.
They and the soul itself are invisible in the same way that the air is invisible. In one's early life, the veins, arteries, and sinews are the determinants of the soul. But when the soul settles down into itself and becomes strong, then rational thoughts and the exercise of deliberate choice become its determinants.
That makes sense, right? Remember we talked about moral emphasis, blending everything together. The moral life that you lead kind of forms your soul so that it's ready to go on to a better life, like reincarnated, in a higher way. Plato gives you a hierarchy of reincarnation. It basically follows kind of like a social hierarchy, which is what you have in Hinduism, right? That's why in Calcutta, people are treated so poorly because there's this idea of karma that it's your fault. If you're dirt poor, that's your fault. It means you were really bad in your previous life. And if I'm wealthy and successful, it's because I was good. If I'm born into a wealthy family, it's because I was good. So I'm not going to feed the person because they're getting what they deserve. They're working out their karma, being punished for what they previously did in their previous lives. Like they must have been a really bad criminal. And then let's not get in the way of that. And then that's why people are dying in the street, right? But you see that here, right? The similarity, your deliberate choice determines the nature of your soul and then what it is reincarnated to.
In reading that, it sounds to me like Pythagoras is talking about a development of a rational soul, like we're all born with this sensory soul, but as we develop in our lives, our rational soul develops. Is that?
I mean, certainly you observe that we don't use reason. A little infant doesn't use it.
Right.
So the power goes on. Reason is what's immortal. And then, right, when he says the veins, arteries, and sinews are the term as the soul, like maybe thinking of reflexes, like a little child has reflexes, that's what, it hasn't started to use its reason yet. So the idea of an age of reason is definitely right there, that you have to attain it. Who's next? Brian?
Okay.
So you're gonna, this first sentence you're going to read, Ryan, this is why I'm saying he's a materialist, because it makes it pretty unequivocal.
So we're going to start with when cast out upon the earth?
Right.
Okay. When cast out upon the earth after death, the soul wanders in the air like a body.
Right. So it's now it's not a tangible body, but it's wandering in the air. So he's going to talk about it. In other text, I think it's like going up to the higher air if it's good. Yeah.
Hermes is the steward of souls. He is called the escort, keeper of the gates, and Hermes of the underworld, because it is he who guides the souls by land and by sea to the uppermost region.
All right. So depending on where you died, if you died at sea, if you died on land, he guides you to the uppermost region. Now this is the good souls who aren't being reincarnated. So the really good souls are not reincarnated, and the really bad souls are not reincarnated. The good are rewarded, and the bad are punished. Remember, we already saw that in kind of the ancient Greek myths, but he's developing that a lot more. And
Whereas the impure are not allowed to come near to the pure, nor even near to one another, but are bound by the Furies and unbreakable chains.
So interesting, because I mean, you could read saints who will say the same thing about what happens to the souls after death, that they're separated, and heaven is a blessed place because there's no evil there anymore. Okay.
The entire air is filled with unembodied souls, which are called demons and heroes.
So you pronounce it daimons?
Daimon, yeah.
Remember, demons, for us, a demon is always evil. For them, daimon does not mean demon. It just means a spirit. You could just translate it spirit, but I guess they don't want to do that. Okay.
It is they who send dreams to mortals, importance of coming ills and blessings.
Right, so the whole thing about divination, like if you have a dream, okay, let's figure out what was the meaning of that. The entire air is filled with these souls that can send us dreams and so on. Next, Michael.
The most momentous thing in human life is the art of winning the soul to good or to evil.
Right, so you see how it all fits together, the morals, the metaphysics, the aesthetical practices, all these things, dietary, to win the soul to good or evil. On the next page, the symbols, right, he explains the meaning of them, right? A step beyond, not beyond the center of the balance, like the idea of moderation, right? Don't eat too much, don't eat too little. Don't drink too much, don't eat too little. Don't sleep too much, don't sleep too little. All those things. Go not by the public road, right? Don't be a conformist, right? Just because everyone else is doing something doesn't mean you should do it, right? So he, according to one thing, he only worshipped the altar of Apollo because he wanted to show his conception of God is higher. You can keep reading. It gives some dietary restrictions.
Salt should always be placed on the table and served with the meal. It is a symbol and reminder of what is right. For salt preserves whatever it finds and it arises from purest sources, the sun and the sea.
So is there any parallel that comes to mind between like faith and reason here?
Salt of the earth.
Right. So see how these are ideas that existed in the Greek culture that Jesus could have heard about because he's a Palestinian Jew. It's a Hellenistic culture. And I mean, I'm sure he spoke Greek, right? Because Aramaic was the local language of people back then. Greek was the lingua franca, right? So he could have heard about that. Maybe he heard about it and used it, or it's just an excellent metaphor that could spring up in different places, right? Because you can't really corrupt salt, right? It's what purifies other things. So it could either be an influence, who knows, right, or not. Regardless, it does show you a harmony between faith and reason, right? To keep the idea of purity, of keeping ourselves pure from evil. Okay, let's see. You know, he talks about abstaining from animal flesh, so vegetarianism. If you wonder, the first vegetarian in the Western world is Pythagoras. Also, if you know Hinduism, right, also very similar to Hinduism, a lot of them are very strict vegetarians, so that was another idea he could have taken. It's consistent with reincarnation, right? If it could be a person reincarnated in the animal, then you don't want to kill and eat the animal. So that would explain the vegetarianism. 227, so I was right. Assist a man in lifting a burden, not in laying it down. The commentaries explain, right? It's difficult to be virtuous, so help people to be more virtuous. Don't like say, let's go get drunk together. You know, let's go to the casino. Let's, I don't know, whatever. Let's just not do anything and just I don't know, watch TV and not do anything, whatever it might be. So the burden of virtue is something we should help each other with. Similar scripture imagery, right? Does that right, make sense? Go by the public road. Remember Christ said the path that leads to perdition is very broad and easy and many take it. So there's many striking parallels to that. And I think this is why the fathers of the church, St. Clement of Alexander said that the logos, the grammaticos logos, the seed sowing word, was putting all these seeds of the gospel in Greek philosophy, that when the gospel came, people were like, wait a minute, that's kind of like what Pythagoras said. Maybe that's actually true. Maybe he's not just some crazy Jewish, guy from Palestine, right? Who was just, we shouldn't pay attention to. Remember, assist a man lifting a burden, not laying down. He reproaches the Pharisees. Remember, he says, you lay up heavy burdens to put on other men's backs, but you won't lift a finger to help them. So that similar image. Do not sit on a bushel measure. The kind of like the idea of straw, like worldly concerns are straw. Don't be attached to them. The commentary says it's about detachment, because right, bushel is gathered straw into a bushel. Do not tear away the crown. The commentary says it means you should respect authority. Abstain from beans. I think that's the Hindu influence. Dietary restrictions. Lots of speculation on that. Always serve salt with the meal. He's not actually talking about putting salt in the meal. I mean, sure, it makes things taste better. No one can deny it. But what he really means is that what we had on the previous page, right? Salt should always be served with the meal as a symbol and reminder of what is right. The need for moral purity, right? It preserves over time, right? To not kind of lapse into vices or imperfections. So every one of these has a commentary.
For stones in the fountain.
Yeah, what is S10's commentary?
Yeah, my favorite one.
Oh.
I've never do that, by the way. I've never done that.
So I wrote them. Christ said, "Do not throw your pearls before swine." My little note that I wrote there, is, "Do not throw your pearls before swine."
For S10?
Yep. That's what the commentary says. Yep. Same thing. Like, don't try to respect what's good, and don't give it to what's evil. Do not stick iron into anyone's footprints. Respect people's reputation. Don't spread gossip. I'm telling you, if you read Catholic spiritual theology, you're going to see the same things. I mean, like St. Philip Neri talked about that, about not gossiping about people's reputation. Let no swallows nest on your roof as against idle chatter. Remember how they were supposed to be silent? So swallows, I guess, make a lot of noise. And so it meant don't just chatter, talk all the time. Do not step over cattle's tether. Meant to respect mysteries that you don't understand. Do not turn back in the middle of a journey. What could that be? Anybody?
Don't give up.
And more precisely?
Let your yeses mean yes and your no's mean no.
Well, we start what we read earlier from Plato's Phaedo. And then we'll wrap up. The prohibition of, what did Cabes say? Civis? Anybody?
Prohibition of suicide.
What is that?
The prohibition.
Exactly.
Of suicide.
Don't turn back in the middle of a journey. Don't leave the journey that God has given you by killing yourself. So in a sense, more morally positive than some things we have in our culture, right? Remember, what did Thales say when they said, why don't you kill yourself? It makes no difference. He didn't say, I don't kill myself because it's wrong, because God put me here and I should live the journey he gave me to live. See? So it's quite striking how much truth you can have with reason, but it is, like I said, the primordial tradition. It's not scripture, which is this pure water, right, comparatively speaking. It's primordial tradition. There's also the incarnation, there's bony beings, but there's also a lot of truth there. So it's a good reminder for us, right, that just by the natural law and natural reason, the goodness of human nature, that you can go a long way and you can accomplish a lot without that. And you can start to see why the persecution eventually came, because it was quite strict and really countercultural. Remember, we read the myths. God's running around committing adultery, fornicating, Dionysus, orgies, all this stuff. And here he's saying all these things. So he's reacting against that. All right, so next time, I think that's it for Pythagoras. Next up is Heraclitus. Okay? For next time.
The Son of the Holy Spirit. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen.
Number